Leslie Elliott has come to realize that many universities are sterilizing language. She is a coach and consultant in Washington State with a background in psychology and natural medicine. She works with clients from a person-centered, existential perspective, taking into account the whole person, mind, body, and spirit. In 2019, she began to learn valuable therapeutic approaches in the Clinical Mental Health Counseling Master's Program at Antioch University, but also encountered something deeply disturbing: the usurping of traditional therapy values by critical social justice ideology. Toward the end, Leslie took a leave of absence after her courses began requiring students to sign what was called a civility pledge. Frustrated in her attempts to communicate her concerns to the university, she decided to go public in October 2022 and expose how ideology is corrupting the fields of mental health and higher education. During our interview, we explore why coercing speech can be both sterilizing and dehumanizing, the impact of selective empathy on Americans' mental health, and the phenomenon of being labeled an unsafe person, as some people's emotions take precedence over others. We also explore the roots and reasons for Leslie co-founding the Solid Ground community to support individuals impacted by divisive ideologies. I'm Sienna Mayheath, and this is Leaving the Left for Liberty. So we've been getting to know each other through the Solid Ground community. And the mission statement really spoke to me, as well as the image, which is an image of a well-rooted tree. And we can talk more about that later, but I just want to read the mission statement to sort of shape the conversation that we'll have. So essentially, it supports people impacted by divisive ideologies, and its mission includes saying that the ultimate goal of authoritarian measures like woke and COVID mandates is to disrupt, divide, disconnect, and dehumanize. And what I love about your approach is that you seek to humanize and see each person as an individual. And I'd love to talk more about the Solid Ground community a bit later, but first, I'm really curious to hear more about your story and how you came to be a whistleblower on Antioch University's counseling department, and a coach now, and overall a dissident, a modern day dissident in the 2020s.
Yeah, well, so I went back to school in 2019. I went to graduate school for clinical mental health counseling at Antioch, Seattle. And I had been out of school for a little while at that point. And so I was really surprised by some of the new ideology it just felt like it was slipped quietly in to the academic experience. And there was no real explanation given for why we suddenly talk about things like race and gender the way that we do. Why do we suddenly need to announce our pronouns? It's just done. This is just how we do things now. And so it was really surprising to me. And also some of it seemed just patently unhealthy, mentally unhealthy, socially and individually. And I found it to be quite out of place in an applied psychology program where we're training people to counsel others and to help people with their mental health. So for a little while, I was just sort of observing this, and it kind of came to a head for me in a multicultural perspectives course, where I was trying to engage in a dialogue with the professor around some inconsistencies that I was finding and some concerns that I had about these approaches. And it was a very forceful, emotional, and coercive process. And so through that, I started trying to research and read more about what this was that I was encountering, and learn to understand, and I guess have a language to articulate the experience that I was having. I didn't really have a sense of this as an ideal, so sort of like an ideology per se. It just seemed like it was a bunch of different parts, and things weren't making sense. And I came across New Discourses, James Lindsay, and his information was very helpful. But the most helpful thing to me was finding an essay written by Val Thomas, published on New Discourses. And I reached out to her, and she was forming a group called Critical Therapy Antidote. And it seemed to really encapsulate, like, these people truly understood what was happening in the counseling field and why it was so damaging. And so that was kind of that's sort of the lead in and the framework for where I began to understand what I was experiencing in school.
Right. And the framing of that multicultural course, I think would be a good segue to get to know you a little bit better. As I understand, the acronym of addressing was
Mhm.
used to identify each student based on their race, socioeconomic status, and so forth. Could you remind me what the acronym of addressing stands for?
Let's see. It's a list of socio-demographic categories. So it's age, disability, acquired disability, genetic, what is it? Religion, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, sexuality or sexual orientation, indigenous status, don't know, and maybe nationality, and then gender identity or gender. So it's just a list of demographics, and for each one of these, you can be assigned a status of oppressor or oppressed, marginalized, or privileged. And we were taught first day of this multicultural class, we were taught that this is the model we're to use to understand ourselves in relationship to society, and we're to use this model with each new client as they come in order to understand how we're supposed to relate to them, which one of us is the person with the privileged status, and which one of us is marginalized in the relationship.
Interesting. And I do recall from listening to some of your content that you were actually a racial minority and that this was actually a part of your journals, right? That were exposed to the class and members of the department at large. Could you tell me a little bit more about that?
I did talk about some of my own experiences as a kid. I I sort of framed this. I really believe that what we're talking about when we're talking in these really rigid terms about race in the US, we talk about black and white, we talk about white versus non-white or BIPOC or POC or however they're categorizing um, non-white individuals. And I see this as more of an in-group, out-group dynamic. Anytime you have a majority and a minority, you're going to have tensions, and that's going to be the case wherever you are in the world, depending on how well you're fitting in with the population at large. And it's a real experience, and it deserves discussion. And I think that it is important to give that kind of context if you're a counselor going into a particular area and understanding the demographics, understanding the context from which your clients are likely coming. And so I do think that it's important to have these kind of discussions, but the way this was being addressed was very rigid and very reductive without any sense of that social nuance. And so one of the examples that I was giving to my professor in this series of journals, we were required to write reflection journals. As we read and listened to the material throughout the week, we were supposed to respond in a journal to the teacher. And these were supposed to be private and confidential completely. Not, and there was a clause in there not to be shared unless the student was representing a harm to themselves or others. It was a very high degree of confidentiality that we were promised, because we're supposed to basically be working through these difficult emotions, sort of a struggle session in these journals. And so I was writing, I did write about this, and it's not something I wanted to use as a victim badge, because I don't believe in doing this race to the bottom, victim status signaling. And so I wasn't saying, poor me, I grew up in the minority, but I did want to address, like, some of the factors that you're talking about here. Even in the United States, we have pockets where a white person might be in the minority and might have experienced a lot of these same social uh, pressures and experiences that we're attributing solely to this other group. And to look at people and think that you know something of substance about their history just by observing a superficial physical characteristic like skin color, it misses a lot. So I was writing with her about these experiences, and I was getting dismissals, and I actually shared some of these on some of my YouTube videos. So I went through some of them. It was she did share information from my journals with the class in order to shame me. And this was a really difficult experience. And then she shared my journals directly with colleagues of hers after I left the class. So she has violated my privacy directly, even according to the syllabus. And that's been that was really disappointing.
And when you talk about this sort of binary black and white approach, I think it's interesting to highlight a bit of a bit about your teacher at the time. Was she the one that was essentially a white Latina?
Yes, I guess you could say that. She was a blonde-haired woman, probably in her early to mid-30s, blonde, fair-skinned, and considered herself to be Latina because of her mother's, I guess, her mother's background.
What did she say to introduce herself?
Well, she told us that she looks like just a basic bitch and a Becky because she's so fair, but she's actually marginalized because she's half Latina. So
That's funny, but it's also like interesting because like rather than her lean into the complexities of maybe what her childhood was like and how she experiences the world, even in that very like surface level way, rather than lean into the complexities and perhaps the gray area, she just set herself apart and then she set you apart on the other side.
yeah, I guess that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And you mentioned this dehumanizing language and dehumanizing approach, and you I've heard you call it sterilizing, which is an interesting way to put it because it's like um, kind of cleaning or swiping away of complex, what makes a human, a full self with complex experiences that can't be addressed, in that addressing acronym. Could you tell me more about how, especially in these early stages of your counseling courses at Antioch, how are you seeing this sterilizing and dehumanizing process, especially within the context of language?
Um, let's see, that's a great question, and I'm not really sure how to address it fully. I will say that I did have some very good courses, especially early on. I had a couple of very strong courses where that was not, I wouldn't say that that was an issue. I think that these were classes that um, any counselor would be lucky to have in their training history. Strong skills, counseling skills course, a strong family of origin course, a family systems therapy course that was very good. And really the first time I started to encounter this was that multiculturalism course where it was really out of context with the other educational content I had received up to that point. And uh, I could go into that at greater length, but it goes on a lot like what we were just talking about. It's very reductive, very childish, very sophomoric descriptions of different identity categories for people. But where it started to really become more prevalent and more present, more forceful was in the communications that I was receiving, that the student body was receiving from the administration. And so it would be like the Justice and Leadership Council would send out memos and inviting us to do certain things, or the chancellor or the provost would send out missives on different political or current social events. And this is where a lot of that language was really intensifying as I was going through the program. The social justice stuff, where there's this really reductive view of people based on identity categories, started to enter into every course, but it was almost like an addendum. Like it was like this little, oh, and in your paper, in your case formulation, here, devote a paragraph to describing multicultural factors. And so you had to sort of go in and use that language. But it was in addition to more complex analysis of the given case that did give some quite a bit of room for nuance and care. So there were a lot of contradictions because you had these elements that were coming in alongside other more classically oriented formulations.
And you started this program in 2019, right?
Yes.
Okay. I can see how that timing would be significant in the way of it being a gradual process, leading up to the election and those tensions. And what strikes me about this being in the context of counseling and mental health is the theme of safety. That often comes up in the key questions that are asked. Are you a threat to yourself or others? And that was the guidelines for you turning in your journals. It's like, as long as you're not a threat to yourself or others, there would be confidentiality. But now we know that their definitions of what is unsafe and what is safe are quite subjective. So why do you think that confidentiality was broken when you turned your journals in?
Well, I think that the first breach was sloppiness on part of the teacher. It was in dialogue in the course. I tended to be the only person who spoke up in class with questions about the way that she was, the things that she was talking about and the inconsistencies that were being presented, and some of it was just, I mean, just sort of patently offensive, stereotyping and categorizing of people. And so sometimes there would be examples that she would give where it begged for someone to ask more questions about this. Why are we thinking about people this way in a graduate counseling program? And so in one of these dialogues, she was talking to the class, and I think that it was a question about, it was code switching. So the concept of acting more like your racial expectations in one situation versus another with different racial groups. And so there was a question, and I brought up something about this, and she divulged something from my my journal, which was basically this aspect of me growing up in a minority, in a racial minority. And I hadn't really talked about that. I don't think I had revealed that in the class and spoken up, because I didn't want to call attention to that. It wasn't about like, oh, look at me, I have special victim status too, carve out an exception for me. And she brought this up, and it was quite embarrassing that she did it the way she did it. And then she told me that I needed to reparent myself if I wasn't to be a harm to my future Latino clients. And it was so this was information that she could have only gotten through the dialogue we'd had via journals. And so I think that was just kind of sloppiness, and it was sort of an emotional, trying to put me in my place and trying to get me not to speak back in class. And it might have even skipped her mind where she'd gotten that information. So she wasn't being very careful about talking about it. But in terms of her divulging my journals later, I didn't know this until I was going back to go over some of the coursework from that class. That class was very painful for me. It was a really difficult experience to be the only person standing up to a teacher who was, sort of gaslighting and bullying, and just also being exposed to this social justice ideology, and coming up against that and going, what the heck is this? Why are we talking about people this way? And why on earth are we telling counselors to treat their clients this way? And so I hadn't wanted to go back and revisit any of that material. And I did, it was this past summer, and I did it for someone else who was gathering information on these counseling programs. And when I went into the Google Drive that I hadn't accessed till then, I saw that she had shared it with at least one other colleague. She'd shared my journals with at least one other colleague. And when I went and looked at who that colleague was, she's someone whose focus is social justice. And so I raised a grievance with the school. I filed an official grievance, which was dismissed and not investigated seriously by the school. And they said that if she shared my materials, it must have needed to be shared for academic purposes. So that was their excuse for why she did that. I can't know why she did that, because I wasn't a part of that decision and nothing was conveyed to me. I can suspect that she did it in order to demonstrate this is one way that people push back against these kind of teachings. How can we strategize to work with students who put up resistance? You know, I can I can speculate, but I really don't know why that was shared.
Interesting. I mean, I'm just speculating around the theme of safety and unsafety,
Hmm.
that basically, within this critical theory framework, if you are deemed to be propagating ideas around like white supremacy, then naturally they like if they see you that way, then they see you as a threat, I guess.
Yeah, and I don't see how you could have taken anything that I ever said as even an even white supremacist adjacent. I've never said a thing that's white supremacist. I'm not a white supremacist. I don't believe that white people are supreme. I don't believe that there is um, any racial group that has more value than any other racial group. We're all human beings, and I've maintained that sort of individual neutrality, and I will defend that forever. So it's just the resistance. I think that it's just people. I don't think that they have that many people resisting this stuff in a substantive way, from what I saw, from what I've experienced. I think people are intimidated, and I think some people are accepting it, and people are accepting it to greater or lesser extent. But even those who are resisting it in their minds, I think of that subset of people, I I suspect that not very many of them are being vocal about that. And so when someone is vocal about that, they want to know, how do we work with this, and how do we either keep these people quiet, or how do we overcome their resistance and get them on board with our thinking?
You mentioned three behaviors that I find really relevant: intimidation, gaslighting, and bullying, which are a part of the cycle of abuse, right? I actually wrote down like the four main stages, which are tensions building, breakdown of communication, and increased fear. So we see this with the twisting of language, and naturally that creates a suppression of language. Then there's incidents, blaming and intimidation. So that goes along with the shaming that you experience, trying to intimidate you out of speaking,
Mhm.
speaking out, speaking your mind. Then reconciliation, the abuser claims it wasn't as bad as the victim says. And finally, calm, the incident is forgotten and likely the cycle will continue. How do you see the cycle of abuse being relevant to what you've experienced?
Oh, I think that I think you can pretty neatly fit what happened in the course of that particular course into that framework pretty nicely. Um, there were I made multiple attempts to reach out to the professor and talk to her. Um, I was either dismissed, ignored, or I was told that my concerns were based on my white fragility. And um, let's see, finally, she cried in class. Um, So yeah, there was one day when she was asking for feedback on the course from students. So she had us go into little groups and say, what had we hoped at the beginning of the semester that we would learn from this course, and what had we learned, and then what did we wish had been different. And so my partner and I actually agreed that we wished that, and this was, everything was sort of oblique. I didn't even feel like in there I could really say all of the things that were disturbing me about it. But I said I felt like it was taught on a really shallow level, and it would have been nice to delve deeper into these issues, because that honestly is my main criticism of the social justice framework. Is that we're talking about things that are useful to talk about, and that are real, like the tensions between people based on disparity and relative social position. I think that these things are very valid to discuss if we're taking so the sociological context in which the people that we meet will will be coming from. I mean, I think that that's really important to take those into account. However, this framework falls so short, and it's it's a caricature of what real social dynamics are. So we had talked about that we wish this were done in more depth. And when we brought this to the teacher, as she called around to the different groups, and we gave our little feedback, she sort of dismissed it and kept going. And I said, oh no, I don't think that's not exactly what we meant. What we really meant was, and I told her, and then she started to cry, and stood up at her desk in tears and said that she had given so much of her emotional labor to the course. She used the phrase emotional labor. And I don't know, it was something really direct at me. I can't remember what exactly her words were, but sort of basically implying that I had been ungrateful and wasn't being respectful by questioning her. And you could have heard a pin drop. And then a person who was sitting to my left, who was a trans woman, spoke up and said, I think we've heard enough white voices for now. And so it was a very, that experience, when you're talking about the cycle of abuse, I waited until I got out of the classroom to really freak out. I just kept my composure and sat there with all eyes on me and silence, and having just been cried at and called a bully by the teacher, and then having been told to keep my white voice to myself by a white person sitting to my left. And so in terms of like an abusive experience, that felt that way to me. I then reached out to the professor and I said, I sent her an email and I said, something conciliatory about her tears. Like, I certainly never intended to make you feel emotionally attacked at all. And I'm sorry that, and I gave her an apology. I don't think I had anything really to apologize for, but I didn't know what to do about this. And so she didn't reach back out to me until after the course. And in the meantime, she gave me a narrative review for the course that said that I needed to go get counseling so that I would not hurt racial minorities with my white views, I guess. I don't remember her exact words, but I needed to go avail myself of individual therapy in order to serve clients from minority backgrounds. So
okay, so she was implying that you were mentally unwell while she was the one that was sobbing at the front of the class. And actually, I have a lot of empathy for her, like, just because, to cry in front of a group, like, that takes an emotional toll. I get that. At the same time, I think your feedback was very gracious. You said you wanted to go deeper on the issues that she was teaching. So there's that. And then the experience of having the trans-identified male stand up and say, I think we've had enough of you. I think brings up the double standards of how certain people are more free to fully express themselves and at times abuse others, while people of other groups just have to sit there and take it. Do you see that double standard?
I do. I hesitate to use that as too much of a symbolic experience. That individual was never anything other than kind and a good fellow student. That incident was sort of the only time, and I don't know if it's based on sociocultural demographic identity, that this person carried this unique identity marker, and that made this person feel more free to speak in that moment, or if it was just a protective impulse towards the teacher who was indicating vulnerability, and it was an attempt to sort of soften this feeling and sort of throw the easy target under the bus. I mean, the idea of whiteness had been under attack. White people had been under attack throughout this whole course. So it was a really easy bullseye to just say that no more white voices. And I felt like that was a horrible and callous and nasty phrase. And if you substitute any other racial category right there, like if somebody says, I think we've heard enough Asian voices for now. I mean, who would tolerate that? That's not a tolerable statement. It should never be okay to say something like that. And yet the culture of the class was such that that was an easy target and an easy thing to say. So yeah, I hesitate to use it as that particular incident and call that person out for that, but I can see how that does play out in general. Yes. If you are someone who has more of the special victim status, you're more untouchable. It's easier to stand up and say that anybody who's targeting you is targeting you for these particular reasons. And so you have sort of a built-in cudgel to ward off, any kind of criticism.
And that also sounds like scapegoating, which is another symptom of abuse. Um, I do want to point out that there is this phenomenon of like being anti-woke, that
Mhm.
that movement, in which it's so easy to fall into that collectivist mindset of like, well, that person did that because they're of this identity.
Mhm. Mhm.
So when I think this happens in other areas too. When you become anti something, you just become another version of the thing that
Yes.
you're fighting
Yeah,
against.
that's so well said. Yes, I agree.
Yeah. So then what happened? Because from your videos, I got the sense that the tensions really revved up and there was more like publicizing of your voice, in a really antagonistic way, like implying like you shouldn't listen to her.
Mhm.
So again, like we've had enough of you.
Yeah, so there's actually a little bit of space in between those two things. I took a leave of absence after that course. I went through one more quarter, and then I was so haunted by this, and I'd gone back and forth with the department chair about whether I wanted to file an official grievance. And part of the reason that I ended up not filing that grievance is that it was going to entail a series of conversations between me and this professor in like a mediation setting, and the department was going to have their representative, this professor, and myself. And so this felt like a really bad power imbalance when I was already being accused of being a white supremacist and some mentally ill person who wasn't able to get on board with social justice ideology and the concept of racial broaching in therapy and these other issues that I was really begging for nuance around. I wasn't saying don't belong at all. I was just saying, is there this the way that we're talking about this is really wrong. But I was being mischaracterized in this way that felt it really it felt very unfair, and I felt like the cards were stacked against me. So the grievance process was going to be like this, and I was also going to have to open up all of those journals and have the faculty inspect them so they could see who was right and who was wrong. And at this point I was feeling like the the faculty were all seeming like they were at least to some degree on board with this new ideological way of thinking, and it felt very intimidating. And so I chose to accept her narrative evaluation, even though it felt like a complete breach of academic um, ethics and authority for her to use my narrative evaluation to call out my mental health. Um, so I didn't file the grievance. I went through one more quarter, and then I transferred out of that program, and I transferred to another Antioch campus because I could keep all my credits that way. I didn't have to lose the time and money I'd already put into the program. And my hope was that maybe it was because it was in Seattle that this program was so intense. By then I was really realizing that sort of the culture of Seattle had a lot of this like far left sort of progressivism. And I thought, well, I'm in Antioch, Seattle. Maybe if I transfer to the New England program, I will have a little bit better experience there. But around this time, we're in 2020 now. We are in COVID, and then George Floyd, and the this is when the communications from the department and the head of the university started to really become much more political and much more forceful. And so in 2021, I was taking a required course, and I was required to sign a civility pledge in order to take the course. The first assignment was go to the syllabus, read the civility pledge, and post in the forum for the class that you agree with it. And when I went to read what the civility pledge was, it was something I hadn't noticed in the syllabus prior. It was social justice language. It was about agreeing with all the isms and this framework, and about marginalized and privileged identities. And I just realized I can't sign this. And so I dropped the course because I knew that it was either sign that I agreed with it, or publicly post that I don't agree with it, or try to do some little footsie thing in the middle where I kind of rephrase it and make something out of it that I could agree with. But at this point, I was feeling so bullied by this ideology that I didn't feel like I could even do that. So I waited another semester, tried to take the course again. Different professor, came up against that same civility pledge. And this was a required course that I couldn't complete the program without. And I was almost finished with all of my coursework. So I scheduled an appointment with my faculty advisor and I told her of some of my concerns. And she told me that she knew that the social justice rhetoric was going to just increase. So if I didn't like it, I needed to get through the program as fast as I could. And then she told me that they knew that they are no longer training counselors that are going to be able to work with the Trump supporter. And that's what she said. And so to this school, what a Trump supporter is might be different than what just anybody, I mean, I don't know what you think of when you think of a Trump supporter, but to them, this is a label like Nazi, it's, if you're not with us, you're against us. A Trump supporter, it doesn't have to be somebody who's got a Trump shirt and a Trump hat. It's just somebody who would vote Republican or would, it's become almost I don't know, an identity category of its own for them. And regardless, I thought this is insane that I'm speaking with a licensed professional counselor who's a teacher in a university who's saying we're not training counselors who will work with people who vote for a candidate we don't like. And so it was a little while after this that I put out that video, that first Antioch video, when I decided I really can't progress through this program without violating my conscience. And yeah, one of their early responses was to send out a memo to all students and faculty, except for me. I didn't receive this. It was like selectively omitted from my email, but saying that don't listen to, there's a white supremacist voice on the internet, and don't listen to this voice. Don't give this voice any more power. And warned people. And they set up a crisis team, 24/7 crisis team for anybody who might have seen my videos. And I mean, if you want to link that first video, it's like 8 minutes long. Just if people, I said at the time, this is a gift that they put this memo out because they're making my argument for me. Because if you listen to the things that I say in that video, there is absolutely no way you can come away thinking that I'm a white supremacist. And yet that's what they're calling me. And they're calling me a transphobe and telling all the students that they have a crisis team ready to help them and that they shouldn't pay any attention to my videos. So they brilliantly illustrated my us versus them argument that I was making against that I was saying that they were guilty of. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the long narrative.
Thank you for filling in those spaces for me.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, so dramatic, right? Like that you'd have a 24/7 crisis hotline just devoted to and the effects you might have on them. Yeah. And meanwhile, this is all within the context of counseling, of mental health. Like it's crazy. And I did watch that video of yours, and I was amazed at how level-headed you were. Now, of course, you had collected yourself to make such a video, but I can tell that as you recall your story, there have been moments where you steadied yourself. And I'm amazed considering, what you were putting up with. When you said that they were deliberately training counselors to not work with the Trump supporter, that really struck me because, first of all, you're right. What is a Trump supporter? They already have this skewed narrative of what is a white supremacist. I get the sense that there are folks out there who will label someone a Trump supporter when they're actually not. Like they haven't even voted for him. So we have this subjective language forming, and we have serious societal ramifications for not helping a population of people with their mental health. I mean, even if you come from the perspective that supposed Trump supporters are dangerous, all the more reason to help them, right?
And that's a really good point. I think that's a great point. And I think that, yeah, it's this conflation also. There's this forced teaming and this false equivalency that's going on. When have we ever talked about people in terms of candidate supporter? I mean, when have we talked about voters that way in the past, or people as voter? Like, the most important thing about you that a person should notice about you and use as a judgment to your fitness as a human being is to wonder what candidate you voted for. So, in most elections, people tend to be pretty party loyal. Most people, we've got this portion of the population that's independent, but in the US, most people are going to fall into Democrat or Republican, and they're usually going to check the D or the R on the ballot, no matter whether they fully love that candidate, because they like that platform, that party's platform. They tend to agree more with that than with the other party's platform. If 50% of the country, which is about, it's always really close to 50% of the country who tend to vote Republican voted for Donald Trump. Doesn't mean that they love the guy. Doesn't mean that and honestly, does it matter? I mean, maybe they do love the guy, but for whatever reason, if every single person is judged solely on that one preference that they felt, I guess I just kind of can't picture a world where people think like that, especially people who are trained as mental health counselors, who are supposed to be able to get on the side of their client and understand their client's worldview and understand, people can hold a lot of different, like Aaron Kinsfather. I recently had a conversation with him. Was it Aaron? I think it was actually Ben Harris that I was talking with for my channel. And he made a comment. He said something about misogynists and racists. And then he quickly went back and he said, well, no, it's not about people aren't misogynists and racists, but there are people with misogynist views and people with racist views. Put the person first. Lots of people hold views that others would find wrong. In fact, everybody does. Everybody holds some views that other people are going to find abhorrent or just distasteful or whatever. That's just one aspect of that person. And this political alignment and this political, just this extreme way of visualizing people in accordance with one aspect of their beliefs is really stunning to me. And again, I feel like I started with your question and I sort of went on a ramble and a rant. So I'm not sure if I answered you adequately.
No, that's okay. I'm here for it. I mean, I think one overall theme is that feelings are subjective, and that can be hard to hear when you're in the throes of a feeling, of an emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a reason for the phrase, don't let your emotions rule you. And that also connects to authoritarianism and perhaps self-authoritarianism. Don't let your emotions rule you. And one of the emotions is empathy, that we find in the so-called social justice space. But I don't even see it as true empathy. I see it as more maybe compassion, more so pity.
Mm-hmm.
But if we just see it, I think on that scale, of empathy to pity, do you think that one can be ruled by empathy, compassion, or pity?
I think that's a good question. I think that it's probably a pretty complex topic, because if you think about, just even if we just call it empathy, what we're looking at is people with a very selective empathy. It's not, if you were actually, for instance, one of the things that came up in a human sexuality course during my time in graduate school was this condemnation of people who have unwittingly gone to bed with a transgender person, not knowing that the person was transgender, and then rejected that person after finding that out. We were talked to about the pain that transgender person will feel from the rejection that they experienced. And there was a blanket condemnation for the person who would not accept them for who they were, or who felt cheated or lied to or deceived by that experience. That was wrong, because that was like a genital discrimination or whatever it was that it was classified as at the time. And something that occurred to me was, what about the experience that that person is having? I mean, you can put yourself, everybody should be able to hear that story and imagine the feelings of both people. And without blame, without saying who's right and who's wrong, because we can do that too. We can definitely do that. Analyze it and say who we think made the mistake there. But just as a human being, we understand what it's like to feel rejected, and we understand what it's like to feel not wanted, but we also know what it's like to feel deceived, and we know what it's like to feel disappointed, and we know what it's like to feel shock and surprise, and even sexual revulsion, which is a very real thing, because our sexuality is, it's a very complex and individual thing, and people are attracted to what they're attracted to. So both people in that situation, if we were really having a discussion about empathy, and if we're really talking about, as counselors, how, which is, these people could both come in and be your client. We need to be able to see the world through their eyes. And we were told to focus on one, and the other was just bad. And it's the same with like this Trump supporter. They're no longer worth your empathy. So I don't think of that as being too much empathy. I think of that as being directed, selective, focused empathy, and directed, selected, focused callousness. So maybe there's such a thing as too much empathy. I'm not so sure about that, though. I think that that's not what's really happening here. But it is sort of, I hear this talked about as like an epidemic of over compassion and compassion driving. That, I think that's interesting. I can see why people are saying that, but I think if we really were being compassionate, we would see all angles. We would be trying, and if we were really doing that, we wouldn't be where we are right now.
True, it is selective. And there is a top-down approach to this. It's so interesting that people who believe in critical theory and so forth, that they believe, and I think rightfully so, they believe there are power structures in this country, and yet those who are studying this in academia can't seem to understand that they are effectively also a part of the elite class.
No, absolutely. I think that's something that I thought about as well. I mean, if you're saying that they changed the definition of racism to privilege plus power, or whatever it was, something with power involved. And I thought, well, who has the power but the corporations and the academic institutions? And, these are people pushing this ideology. So if you're really going to talk about power, you've got a giant blind spot about your own power.
One example of a powerful organization, I guess you could call it, or a prominent organization, is in media. It's NPR. And I actually learned from one of your Solid Ground videos with Jody that NPR was introducing a new set of language. And one that stuck out to me was zero dose kids, or zero dose people, which probably is, as you can expect, is people who didn't get any doses of a COVID vaccine. And zero dose kids does not put the kids first. It doesn't put the people first language in place. It inverts it. And what do you think? What do you think the sterilizing of language does to strip one's perception of another as a full human?
Gosh, that's such a brilliant question, and I think there's a lot to unpack there. I think the more we try to remove, so the zero dose kids, that's one example. Another example is to call women AFAB, assigned female at birth, instead of women, to take away mother and father and just use parent. It's removing what it means to be a person down to the very smallest. I mean, it's how to articulate this. I'm not the best person to probably articulate this, but I find it so, it's like this computerizing of our lives. We're going to talk about things in a way that our words become so general as to sum up the most incidences of this potentiality that we can. We're not going to be talking on the individual level. We're getting as collective as we possibly can so that we're doling out any potential for individuality. We could create new language if we wanted to. I mean, we could say the alternative, if you're trying to be inclusive, you want to say parents, but you want to include people who fall out of they don't consider themselves a mother or father because they have their own concept of gender that they're trying to apply to themselves. Well, why not give them a new word? Let them use a new word. Let them be the one who brings a new word to the table and says, I know you want to call me mother or father, but could you call me, whatever, create something and to get more individual and more specific, or just call me by my name. I'm not mom. I'm, and give yourself a nickname and be your own self. But what we're doing instead is this broadening of language, which, it's like we're going to get as big in our categories as we can so that we are talking about wide swaths of collective people instead of individuals.
There are wide generalizations made, like rather than say women and trans-identified males, as I would put it, it's AFAB.
Yeah.
And AFAB is an acronym, yet another acronym, which reminds me so much of 1984, actually. Like
Absolutely.
I'm obsessed with the appendix of 1984, where you can look at the words and the definitions of that fictional world. And so many of them are acronyms, which kind of like they limit the human mind to wrap their heads around what that is. Honestly, I didn't know what AFAB meant for the longest time.
Yeah.
I didn't think it was relevant to my life. But nonetheless,
now I want to go look at that appendix or that.
I know, now I do too. Yeah. I'd love to talk more about like safety and freedom and the phenomenon of being called an unsafe person, especially when you have been the type of person who's perhaps like relatively mellow, shy, compassionate, open to having hours-long conversations, and really getting to know people. And then all of a sudden, there's this shift, we could say, in language and in perspective, where if you don't hold certain beliefs, or if you speak out of line, you're deemed unsafe. And I do wonder if that was an element of what was happening with you at Antioch, was that you were deemed an unsafe person. That's why they needed a hotline to help students cope, I guess. And I was looking at Martin Luther King's quotes. One of his quotes says that there's a civil war brewing inside of each of us, and it's each of our responsibilities to tame that civil war. One aspect of critical theory that I actually find interesting and I can identify with and think that there's validity to is that, maybe it's not critical theory, but sort of like an adjacent philosophical concept that there has been this push in the Western world for us to hide the Civil War, to hide our anger, to hide our aggression. Debatably, it's more enforced on women. That's another conversation. And I think as some people kind of unleash or express even just a sliver of the anger that's brewing beneath, whether they're on the left, the right, or anywhere in between, there's this phenomenon of saying, well, if you lose it, or even if you use a word that the other person finds offensive, you're called unsafe.
So, yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's a good point about how much we are expected to keep inside. And yet, I think a lot of this is the tension between living in a small community and going into the bigger world. Like if we're looking at things from a collectivist standpoint, I think we're experiencing a lot of tension due to globalization, internet connectivity, the networking that we do now, the way that we see ourselves, the way that we engage in social networks on a broader scale versus what we would have more naturally if we didn't have these big social forces available to us. if you think about your friends, like what your actual friendship group would be, your actual social group would be if you were not connected to people via the computer, there would be a lot more room for different levels of disclosure of feelings. For instance, we would see a lot more. We'd see some people who keep things very close to the vest. We'd have our friend who's a bit of a hothead. We'd have our friend who cries really easily, and we know we can always go to them because they're going to empathize with us or whatever. All the different characteristics that we have would be in context of real relationship. And when we're trying to emote and have real relationship online, we're doing something that's really kind of artificial and strange. And so I think a lot of these, a lot of the problems that we're trying to solve with critical theory, that critical theory is trying to solve, it's addressing these, it's taking things like as an accumulation of data points and saying these people are more likely to experience these things in their lives because of these attributes. And therefore, we're going to distill this back down to the individual level, like we're taking a little chip away of the average, and we're going to say anybody who looks like this category of person is somebody who's subject to these events, and we need to work with them in this way as if they have this percentage of this difficulty in their life. When in reality, it's not that simple. We're all very different. We all have such a wide variety of experiences. And the idea of safety is really interesting because if you want to break it down, what does that even mean? Like, what does it mean to be safe? Does that mean to be comfortable? Does that mean to never have to face uncomfortable thoughts, feel bad, have your feelings hurt, be offended? I mean, I think that that's kind of where we've been heading. And there's also the concept of repressive tolerance, where some people, if they are the right people with the right views, can do anything in service of trying to enforce their views, whereas the other side, who has the wrong views, can't even step a little bit out of line and voice an opinion without being quickly shut down and seen as unsafe because they're violating the comfort of this other group. That was just like so many different rambles right there. I feel like I started 3 different trains of thought, but yeah, it's a lot to think about.
I do want to pull a thread from something you said earlier, which I think relates to all of this, which is like the contrast between destruction and creation. Like you were saying with language, like why not just create or offer a new word to the table rather than overgeneralize or at times destroy or attempt to destroy another word. And I do find this ideology rather destructive. And we can put that briefly into the context of religion. Like I've heard people say there's no salvation. It's just you're scapegoated, you're tossed aside, and there's no redeeming someone who doesn't fall in line, and there's absolutely no salvation. Do you think that in this framework that it's inevitable that the goal will be revenge?
I think the goal is somewhat revenge, but it's mostly the cultivation of a resentful mindset. I think that's the goal of this ideology. It's to constantly be engaged in a process of investigating social dynamics for hierarchical discrepancies, and then levying the appropriate amount of resentment or guilt and shame, depending on where you fall, and inculcating that in others as well by perpetuating these conversations in this particular way of viewing social dynamics. So I mean, in a sense, it is revenge. It's a constant revenge, though. It's not, I don't think it's so simple as, oh, this is, some people want to say this is anti-white, and that's all it is. Well, it is anti-white, but I think it's so much more than that. I mean, it's, when you get down to it, it's going to be anti, first we're see anti-white, but then you get to where you're a person of mixed race. Well, you still have mixed race privilege because you have part white privilege. And then what's next? Are you just a little too light skinned, or do you not have, did you grow up in the wrong place and you're a little too white adjacent? And what it is, what whiteness is. I mean, then you see people who are clearly not white, who have, views that don't go along with this. And it's their internalized whiteness, it's their internalized white supremacy that's the problem. So, I think white is just this symbolic thing. It's just a thing to attack, really. And so I think that it's a never ending purity spiral, and it's a spiral of resentment that this seeks to create.
Rather than revenge or resentment being a goal or a destination, it's just an ongoing process and an ongoing sort of destruction of the human spirit. Like, I don't see it as anti-white, I just see it as anti-human.
Yes. I think that's exactly
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
I
Because
also go on.
if you follow it to its logical conclusion, you'll have a marginalized culture that comes up and oppresses the privileged down into marginalization, at which point that entire thing will start again and it'll just loop back on itself. So I don't see it as really having an endpoint.
Do you think that there is such a thing as emotional safety?
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, would you say more about that?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of talk about people wanting to be emotionally safe. They don't always use that term, but I think there's a fine line between coddling and just respecting a person. And what I find really frustrating about some of these ideologies is that they completely invert what at least I know to be good, right, and true. Like, it's not even just a perversion, like it's a complete inversion. Like,
Mm.
men can be women being the
Mhm,
most
mhm,
common.
mhm.
I think I'm just gonna take it a little bit to a different place and ask, like, do you think that when someone irrationally believes an inversion, like a complete inversion of reality, that they are emotionally unsafe to themselves and to others?
That's a really interesting question. Emotional safety seems like I don't even know exactly what that means. Like to experience only pleasant emotions that don't disturb you to the point of threatening your concept of life, because that's the process of growth, is to get to a
Right.
to a growing edge where you're uncomfortable. And so the process of emotional pain and discomfort is part of what it means to be a human going through human development. And so to be emotionally safe seems to be like, what, plugged into a video game where you never feel anything, or you're just watching a video and everything's kittens and, Doritos or something.
Yeah, maybe I'm using the wrong word for what I'm
Hmm.
getting at, which I'm getting at more like psychological and emotional abuse,
Okay.
which we were exploring in that cycle of
Hmm.
abuse.
Hmm.
Um, and I do find myself wondering, like, someone who believes in inversion of what I know to be good, right, and true, um, what are they capable of? Like, if they can be manipulated to believe men can be women, for instance, how else can they be manipulated, and what could they be manipulated to do?
Hmm. I think that we probably all have some things that where we have blind spots and we don't realize that we believe things that are pretty irrational at times. I think that there are lots of ways that we develop and maintain our own cognitive distortions. And these could be false beliefs about ourselves, or attributing false motive to other people. I think that, I mean, the field and the practice of CBT is wonderful for helping people to learn to address and recognize when they are experiencing a cognitive distortion. But we do it so regularly. It's just you know, I have blind spots. Everybody has blind spots. And I think that people are susceptible to believing all kinds of irrational things, for lots of reasons. It is really alarming when something is so distorted, but I don't know if it's the belief itself that's, I don't know, it not necessarily dangerous to other people. It's it's I we can be exploited, and we've seen that over the last couple of years as our media has become increasingly monolithic and propagandistic. people are being, the natural impulse to trust and to go along with authority has been exploited. And we've seen people buy into a number of distorted and perverted and inverted versions of reality. And I do think that there is danger in that, but I don't know how to put a fine point on that, because there's lots of danger in the world, and lots of, false beliefs are a source of threat to self and others always. But I think that it's impossible to really get rid of them, because they're as old as people, it's just part of the process of trying to understand life.
Yeah, it's human nature.
Mhm.
Let's talk a bit about the solid ground community and perhaps how it differs from what's called safe spaces in many in many institutions. I've just joined, so I'd actually like to know even more about like how you and Jody Shaw, who's a good friend of mine, the Smith College whistleblower, how you two and a couple of others have started the solid ground community and how it differs from what are called safe spaces out in the world.
Yeah, that's funny. That's a good contrast. So Jody, Jennifer, friend, David Simpson, and myself, we all were involved in doing peer support work through Counterweight previously. And that work was mostly with groups, but also with individuals who were coming to that organization looking for support, looking for understanding, looking for somebody to talk to about these oppressive experiences that they were having, specifically mostly around the social justice ideology and how critical theory was being applied in work, school, even in friendship and family situations where people were feeling isolated and gaslit and bullied by this stuff. And when Counterweight went a different direction and stopped doing that peer support portion, Jody and Jennifer were really instrumental in trying to figure out how we could come together and keep that project alive. And they brought myself and David in, and we've been meeting for a while to try to discuss, like, how do we do this? What does this look like? How do we support people, and how do we provide spaces? And so we launched on January 1st our Solid Ground project, which is we offer weekly peer support groups. Each one of us hosts one. We have a lot of people. It's wonderful. A lot of people coming. We have an online platform as well, so that people can chat with each other and post and connect that way. And then we offer those meetings. So they're 90 minutes long. Anybody who's part of the Solid Ground community can join us, and we just get together and talk about, sometimes it's solution focused, sometimes we're talking about what can we do, sometimes somebody might have a specific scenario that they want to talk through and they want to get the group's feedback on it. Sometimes people just really need to vent. But it's safe in the sense that it's confidential. We're not talking about, we're not revealing each other's identities outside of group. Some people are very private about this because they're in a real bind in their work or school where they feel like they can't talk about their real feelings or their real reactions to what they're expected to go along with. And so it wouldn't be right to expose them. So there's that's the safety element, I suppose. But we're a group of very diverse thinkers. There's people from all different political backgrounds, and some people who are coming because they're feeling oppressed by vaccine mandates, and some people who think the vaccines were great. And so, it's not about debate, and it's not about monolithic agreement either. So it's a nice space for real discussion, honest discussion.
It is, and I think it's an embodiment of what I would say is true diversity being a strength.
Mhm.
I was also really drawn to the logo, which is a deeply rooted tree with a heart in the center. Why did you choose that logo, and what would you say is growing out of that soil?
Oh, it is a beautiful logo. I can't take any credit for that. That would be a question for Jody, because she presented it and we just all loved it. I suppose it is symbolic to me. I see the tree of life, and I think that it's important to be to balance our collective nature with our individuality. I don't think that we are you can't look at people as being purely collective or purely individual. And it's that tree of life is sort of symbolic of the organic formation of what it means to be a living being. It's earthy and it's natural and it's messy and it's not perfect. It's not zeros and ones. It's not sterile. It's a living, breathing thing.
Thank you for bringing it back to the sterilizing theme. I was just thinking about the contrast of growing and sterilizing. And I've heard too that like in some of these more recent solid ground meetings, there's been an emphasis on what are we creating? And what maybe another way of putting it is what are we growing? And also how can we reflect and consider how we might do things differently? And I'm curious for you, if you knew what you knew now, how might you have done things differently in the past few years?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know. I feel pretty at peace with how things are unfolding for me as an individual. I I still wrestle with the idea of finishing my program that I was involved in. I mean, I went to school for several years and was at the end of a master's curriculum when I sort of blew it up and walked away. I could go back and finish, I suppose. I'm still in legal discussion with the university. I don't think I will go back and finish. I'm really unhappy with this what they're supporting and standing for, and I don't want to support that myself. But so I have some unfinished business in terms of my own reconciling my own academic and career path right now. I've walked away from the opportunity to finish a master's in clinical mental health counseling and subsequently get licensed if I wanted to do that. So that path is now either closed for me or more tortured, at least. At the same time, I'm glad that I went through what I did go through at the school. I feel like there was valuable information still for me to receive. And the process of learning about how to stand up for my principles it's been nothing if not interesting. Um, so if I could do anything different, I can think um, of a lot of things in my life I would probably do different. But with respect to this, I feel like I've made my choices really carefully and intentionally along the way. And I am just open to seeing where things go from here.
Intentionality, I think, is one trait that many dissidents share. What other traits would you say that modern day dissidents have in common?
That is such an interesting topic and such an interesting question. And it's something that I really would love to explore more because I think that it's probably a lot of things. What what made me comfortable enough, even though I wasn't comfortable, to speak up in that classroom setting when the other people, and I know there were a few who felt like I didn't speak up. And I don't know. It's like a combination of circumstantial factors and perhaps temperament. And so we all want to be we all think that if we could go back in history, we'd be the one to hide Anne Frank. But would we? Would we have been? And what particular aspects of self make us who we are right now and make us willing to speak out against something that peer pressure is telling you go a different direction. I think that for me myself, I tend to be a really agreeable person who I like people a lot. I want to get along with people. I tend to be I want people to like me. I want to like them. I'm highly agreeable. I tend to be. And so for somebody like that to stand up against something, it's not like I'm a disagreeable person who's just standing up against everything. So for me, it meant that the the moral conviction had to be high enough. I had, two opposing forces, right? You've got this is violating my conscience, but I really want to go along and get along. And so the violation of conscience had to reach a certain level before I was able to say, no, I'm going to go ahead and be disliked and be hated, actually. So I think it's just so individual. And another factor for me that probably made me more likely um, to see it for what it was and stand up to it was that I was among one of the older people in my course. So I had more life experience and I had a little bit more, I guess, ego strength and just sense of self. Uh, it wasn't as easy to intimidate me as it would have been for me if I were younger, for my own, myself. It's not something innately me. That's why I say it's probably a combination of temperament and circumstances. But I'm very interested in that. If you have any thoughts about that, I'd love to hear it.
I'd love to do a part two with you on that.
All right.
Oh, great. And where can people find you and Solid Ground?
So Solid Ground is solidgroundsupport.com. You can go there and check us out. And we do a live stream every Monday where we just have a chat about some topic that's relevant and culturally current. And those are a lot of fun. They're really, really a good conversation. So we do that every Monday on my YouTube channel, which is the Radical Center. I have a series of interviews that I've been working on since November of last year. And those are regularly coming out. Sometimes I do one a week. Sometimes I might have a couple in a week. Sometimes I might not have one for 2 weeks. So I just kind of put them out as I go, and I have fascinating people that I get to talk with about their experiences in psychology and education around these oppressive ideologies. So that's the Radical Center on YouTube. And I'm on Twitter at @JLeslieElliott. And I don't use that very much. I might not be doing that for very long because I find social media very strange, but that's there for now.
That's understandable. And have you started coaching yet?
Yes, I actually started a coaching practice about a year and a half ago when for me the writing was on the wall that I probably wasn't going to finish this program. And I wanted to figure out how I could utilize the skills and education I'd already received. And so I see clients in person and online. And I think it's the Radical Center Consulting.com. So you can
Excellent.
reach out to me there. Yeah.
Sure. Do you have any advice for people looking for like coaches and therapists who, may not agree with them on everything, but will regard them as full human beings?
um, well, I think that one thing is if you're browsing profiles and you're looking for a therapist or a coach, look for those signals because the critical social justice people are really big on signaling to one another. And so you'll see pronouns and you'll see just those little phrases that will tell you that this is somebody who is speaking that language. And if you want to stay away from that, just look for those, first of all. Critical Therapy Antidote is a wonderful resource also. It's criticaltherapyantidote.org. And it's a wonderful network of psychologists, counselors, therapists, coaches, and other helping professionals who are concerned with the incursion of critical social justice into the therapy fields. And so you can ask to be connected to someone through that group. And that's one resource for you.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Leslie. It was really a
Absolutely.
pleasure to have you on and get to know you one-on-one.
You too, Sienna. Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. Take care, Leslie.
You too.
Okay.
Bye-bye.